Welcome to everyone who ventured out here on this glorious Sunday morning. Probably the first nice one in a long while, and Erev Pesach to boot. So every one of you is an ongelegter Gast, a very welcome guest. My name is Chava Lapin. I represent YIVO, the board, all kinds of good things, but basically I'm here to bring us all together and to start things off on behalf of YIVO. The executive director was called to Florida, and he sends his best regards, and I'm going to introduce what is happening. Now, we're going to be enlightened and inspired by the Smetana, the cream of Jewish music scholarship and talent presented under the guidance of Mark Slobin. But before we get there, we're going to hear greetings from Mark Mlotik and Fruma Morer. And of course, this event is dedicated to the memory of Chana Mlotik, Zechrono Livrocha, music archivist at YIVO, and for many, many decades, person who enlightened and enhanced everything that was going on at YIVO, a unique woman, a storehouse of Jewish music, who was endowed with equally generous creativity and the capacity to disseminate her vast knowledge. The speakers who follow me are certainly going to talk about Chana and Chana at YIVO, from way back when she was Max Weinreich's secretary until January 2013, when a succession of unfortunate ailments made it impossible for her to come in, and all the sad events followed. I was in touch with her by telephone at least once a week, sometimes more frequently, whenever she was able to chat, no matter how briefly. So I'm going to go on for a few moments in my non-expert chutzpah with Jewish music sort of at YIVO. And anybody who tracks the biblical history of Jewry encounters music from Az Yashir Moshe and Miriam and her women and Dvorah the victorious warrior and so on, the Leviim, choristers and instrumentalists whose sounds filled the outer court of the temple, King David's Psalms, Shir HaMalot, and as we say in Yiddish, Shir HaMailas and Lam Natseach. Come on, let's hear conductor take over, and so on. We know that the elite of Jerusalem, being driven in chains to Babylon, were ordered by their captors to sing the songs of Zion. They objected. Unfortunately, the same thing can be told of events that were much closer to our time, where Jewish musicians had to entertain their captors and their murderers in the extermination camps, and Jewish music includes everything, of course, and all this is at YIVO, from the trop that goes with the Parsha of the week, or the reading of Nach, or the Megillas, different kinds of tropes, which are unbelievably complicated. Until I had to read a portion of Megillah this past year for the first time in my life at my age, I didn't realize quite how complex it was. Down and right through the nigun, the melody of Talmud study, disputation study, ahin aher, which is preserved in the Fir Kashas and has become an endangered species. Anybody under 60 may never have heard it, and I plead with those of you who still remember it to get hold of the bilingual text and introduce it or reintroduce it to your Seder. Jewish music goes back to Adir Hu in Yiddish, which you can find in Yosef Yerushalmi's magnificent Haggadah, in the calligraphed version in his book. Jewish music encompasses the complaint of the seamstress, on the one hand, And the Schneider, who says, mit a Nudel und a Nudel, neich mir bekuvet Gudel, which I heard when I was very young, in the early 40s and 50s in Montreal, sung by an amazing young woman at the time known as Rivke Rubin, who captivated her audience with her seemingly homespun presentations, and more about her later, certainly. And those of you who go on from here to the Workmen's Circle Seder will hear Dayenu in Yiddish and in dem Land von Pyramiden. And if you go to the Actors and Friends, you will hear also an Alter Nigen, which Moshe Ber is doing there, by Lev Kvitko, which I'm sure accounted for at least some of the bullets which riddled him in August 1952 in Lubyanka. The Nigun, Chansons sans parole, we have vast collections of nigunim, ranging from the Hasidic, which are the acme of contact with the Rabbanu Shalom and the spiritual, and nigunim, which were sung at the table on a Shabbos or Yom Tov evening. Chazonas of all kinds, from the Wachedike Minche to Yamam Naroim and Tfilin Nigunim, the riveting plaintive, sometimes riveting, other times songs that motivated the exploited Jewish laborer to examine his situation and to summon up the courage to demand relief and reward for his labor. And I haven't even mentioned folk songs because there are plenty of people going to talk about folk songs. Now, Chana Blotik, together with her husband Yossel, gathered songs of all kinds from all sources, starting decades ago, and succeeding in organizing them into cogent collections that not only preserved them, but made them available from obscure written sources, oral renditions from a population that remembered, from sheet music, from personal archives, emerged probably close to 10 volumes, unmatched in scope and precision. I myself proved 3 of them, The Pearls of Yiddish Song, Songs of Generation, and the last revised expanded edition of Mir Trogen a Gesang. For at least a decade, possibly longer, I sat 20 feet from Chana's office on the archive floor and witnessed her excitement and her enthusiasm at finding something that was new, that was different, her warm reception for visitors, young and old, who came for opinions, for help, for guidance, and for her unfailing good humor. And what she left undone, because of the huge size and varied content and the different sources and conditions of the YIVO collections, remains for an army of young, capable Jewish musicians and archivists to pursue further. At this point, I'm going to welcome Moshe Mlotik to the podium, Chana's son, to bring greetings from the family. And when he is done, Fruma Morer, our senior archivist, will offer her wise words, and I'm not being facetious, they are wise words. And following Fruma Morer, Mark Slovin will take over, and I will leave you in peace. Moshe? Okay.
Thank you, Chava. So, on behalf of the Mlotek family, I have the privilege of thanking the YIVO and each of the distinguished speakers and presenters, and of course, guests who are here today with us today. My mother would have been very happy with the program, both in its content and, of course, the presenters, many of whom she was very close to. And once again, we thank you all. The YIVO, as you all know, is especially important to my mother, not only for the 65 years she worked here, because it was so much more than a job. The YIVO's mission of keeping the Eastern European heritage alive and accessible, so closely connected with her own life's work, that it turned into a very productive partnership. Our parents taught Zalman and me many lessons growing up. One was to always seek to uncover and then acknowledge a source. This not only pays tribute to those that have been creative, it gives encouragement to new generations to be creative, knowing that their names will be remembered. So today's program of Passing the Torch, Archives and Activism, is especially important to my parents and YIVO's mission. Without archives, we have no foundation. Without folklorists giving credit, we have no encouragement. Without activism, we have no future. With YIVO, we have all three. One obscure verse of a poem has the following line, Gedenkje die Nemmen, die heilige Nemmen, written by David Edelstadt, Albert de Freyen. Zalman and I grew up learning the heilige names of Max Weinreich, Ginsberg and Marek, Ansky, Kahn, the Petersburg Gesellschaft. The Ansky expedition was as important to us as the Lewis and Clark expedition. The passion that my mother had for the search, the discovery, finding the source, finding a new variant, singing it, playing it, was something that we grew up with and have in our bones. The fact that she was an encyclopedia of knowledge and knew where each and every song was collected, recorded, published, was a unique talent. It is up to the YIVO, as the only possible institution, to capture that knowledge and make it accessible to others, so that the wonder of the archives become known and that future activists get energized. For the last 10 years of her life, our mother's best days were when she would get an inquiry from either someone on today's panel or a random college or graduate student about a song, poem, play, author, etc. Building on her over 40 years of writing the Perl von der Yiddish Poesie column, where people would send random snippets of songs they would remember, and she would give them the complete poem, author, where it was published in variants, the answers were not that difficult for her. So it was not the challenge that invigorated her, it was the fact that people were still asking and needing information that validated her life's work and, by extension, YIVO's message. So our wish, Zalman and I, is that may each of you in your ongoing work have the same spirit of generosity that she had when sharing her knowledge, and may you all be gestärkt, invigorated, and validated that this message is still important. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mark. I think we all agree with everything that you said about Chana, and it couldn't have been said better. Chana's passing left both a legacy and a void, as we all know. And I'm here to speak to you briefly about what it was like to work with Chana in the YIVO archives, what we feel she accomplished there, what her legacy is, and the irreplaceable void that she left. For the past 25 years, YIVO's music archivist has been associated with its YIVO's Music Archives has been associated with its longtime music archivist, Chana Mlotek, who passed away, as we know, in 2013 at the age of 91. Chana's role as a curator of YIVO's rare and very valuable music collection, as well as Yiddish folklore, can be distinguished by a number of characteristics, which are, as we know, many of us know, Chana's intellectual energy, her love of work, her passion for Jewish music and folklore, and her generosity in sharing these treasures with scholars and with the public. Chana was active in many communal circles. These included YIVO, the Workmen's Circle, Camp Biberik, the Shalom Aleichem Folk Institute, and many others. I will limit my remarks today to Chana's work in the YIVO archives during the time that I worked with Chana as a colleague. From 1984 to 2001, Marek Webb, as chief archivist of YIVO, collaborated closely with Chana in planning out her cataloging and other projects. And from 2001 to 2013, I was privileged to work next door to Chana Mlotek in the adjoining office. And during this time, Chana worked on quite a number of archival collections, all the way up to this past year, including a huge collection, the Hebrew Actors Union archive that she worked on in 2009, during which time she cataloged at least 1,000 musical pieces. I had the privilege of planning some of her projects together with her and observing her at work on her numerous projects. Now, you may have heard about those very famous stories of curators throughout history who held the keys to precious manuscripts and books, keeping them safe from the public. You must have heard about curators like that, who know everything and who have these treasures and nobody can get to them. Marek Webb, my colleague, reminded me of such a story in a work by the French writer Anatole France, whose book, The Revolt of the Angels, contains a description of the well-known Monsieur Sarriette, who created a system of cryptic symbols while cataloging a library of 360,000 volumes. Monsieur Sarriette remained the only one capable of finding his way among the intricacies of the system, and this was quite possibly intentional on his part. And the only reason I mention this story to you is to highlight the fact that Chana Mlotek, who held the keys to our precious musical and Yiddish folklore collections, was just the opposite of Mr. Sarriette. She shared her knowledge with all and cataloged thousands and thousands of musical works, not only for the basic intellectual purpose of uncovering the riches of each collection, which she did with enthusiasm and expertise, but also with the intention of making these materials available to the public. Her cataloging enriched the research community, and people from all over the world came to sit beside her and learn about the collections. I had the privilege of observing all kinds of different people who sat in her office, from music students who came to work on their repertoire with Chana. They had their graduation recitals, or they were cantorial students who were working on their repertoire, or arrangers, composers, pianists who were looking for a different kind of arrangement for a piece of music. There was a time even when I watched these visitors even play on the piano, working out, comparing different versions and working with Chana. Of course, we know that Michael Tilson Thomas was one of the many famous people who came to Chana and whom she helped, and she helped everyone. The Music Archives at YIVO covers a very wide range of materials spanning the entire Jewish popular, folk, cantorial, and theater music repertoire, as well as a lot of field work that was collected by ethnomusicologists. And I recently counted all of the collections, and we have about 2,000 separate collections in the YIVO archives, and I counted about 60 collections that have music in them, some of them very, very large collections and some of them smaller. But and I'm not going to mention too many of them here because you have all of them, the most important ones mentioned in the music brochure that you received today when you came into the building, and which we prepared for you for your convenience. And please feel free to consult the brochure for a more complete understanding of our music holdings. But I'll just mention the largest collections, which is, one of them is the collection of music, and it's a collection that has a large number of popular songs, theater songs, choral music, and art music. And there are two collections which together have more than 1,000 handwritten Yiddish operettas. These two collections are the YIVO, the Vilna Archives collection of music, and the Shalom Perlmutter collection. There are even other collections in the YIVO archives that have handwritten scores of operettas. And then, of course, we have papers of cantors, we have papers of choral directors, composers, etc. So from 1984 to 2013, Chana worked continuously, with very few gaps, on organizing, cataloging these many thousands of works. And as a result of her extraordinary contribution and because of her talent for teaching and guiding researchers, the extensive music archives at YIVO became over time and remains today a very rich and valuable resource for the entire music community. Now, Chana was also trained in and studied Yiddish folklore as a separate field, and she worked on collections in the YIVO archives relating to Yiddish folklore, including the Judah Jaffe papers, the Litwin papers, the papers of the YIVO Ethnographic Committee, and fragmentary materials belonging to Ansky, which are found dispersed throughout the YIVO archives. And drawing upon her work, even before she became the music archivist in 1984, in 1980, Chana Mlotek organized and wrote the catalog for the YIVO exhibition on Ansky, which took place in November 1980 at the YIVO headquarters at 1048 Fifth Avenue. In uncovering the riches of YIVO's music archive, Chana has provided us with increased awareness of the rich tapestry of the Jewish musical heritage. The dozens of finding aids which were produced by Chana Mlatek are among the many valuable living legacies left by Chana for her family, her colleagues, her students, and the public at large. These finding aids remain the key to the thousands of music titles in the YIVO archives. Through the electronic conversion of these numerous finding aids, which we hope to be doing over the next few years, and it's a very important project that we hope to be engaging in, and as well as through the continued development of Chana Mlatek's database of music collections in the YIVO archives, a project begun in Chana's lifetime, which is a database in which, in addition to all the finding aids, individual pieces of music have been entered into a database, and it's a growing work in progress. Through these two types of accomplishments and achievements, the legacy of Chana's work and Chana's spirit will be alive, we hope, and continue to inspire our generation and the next. But despite these achievements, and despite the huge amount of work Chana did, we know that her passing has left a terrible void. She is irreplaceable. Her enthusiasm, her smile, her energy, the love that she had for YIVO, for her work, and she cannot be replaced. I mean, no number of digitization projects and no number of titles is going to replace what Chana did, but we hope that events like the one we have today, where we talk about Chana's legacy and her work, and we discuss the music that she loved, will help to continue the work that she began and help us remember her and take us to the next step in the passing the torch of Jewish music archives. Thank you very much.
Hello, as the moderator of this event, I'm excited to welcome you all and to thank everybody who contributed to this, particularly Helena Gindi and Ludmila Sholokhova of the staff here who put a lot of time into organizing this event, which is extremely rich, and to the Mlatek family, and of course to YIVO in general. This is just the invitation now. We're going to hear, we have two parts, actually 3 parts to this event, and I hope you'll be around for all of them. We're going to have some short papers, first by specialists in this area, and then we're going to have some performative and very enlivening appearance by Lauren Sklamberg, and then we're going to have a round table of people to talk. I'll just say this. Jewish culture is known for its reliance on and its extraordinary devotion to sacred text, and then it's sort of mentioned that they have this oral traditions, which are the other half of the culture, which are extraordinarily rich and underappreciated, but which guided the daily life of all the Jews everywhere in the history of Judaism. All the folk songs, dances, games, superstitions, customs, habits, tales are immensely important in how Jews got through being Jewish and got their sense of community together along with the texts. The archive that we're centering on archives is somewhere in between. The archives are texts about oral tradition, so they aren't exactly one thing or the other of what makes a Jewish world, and that as a result, as mediators, as intermediary between the idea of text, which they preserve, but they're not the sacred texts. They're all the daily life texts and all the production of expressive and extraordinarily heartfelt culture that people bring to their lives. That's in the archive, but it sits there as text. And then it is interpreted, brought to people, preserved by archivists. And so we're paying tribute in a way to the idea of the archive as the intermediary between the life of Jewish communities and their texts, and in older times, because in archives you don't tend to do what's on the internet today, and then the life of people in the future who are going to want to know this, who are going to need this for their ongoing ability to keep up this culture. So it's that intermediary position that I'll be talking about in my talk and how Chana did that. But we have in this panel 3 extraordinary people, and I'll just introduce them at the moment. The point about this panel is how widely distributed geographically this idea of archiving really is. So We have Gila Flam, who is the director of the Archives at the National Library of Israel. Then we have YIVO right here, but also Lyudmila, who talks about Ukraine, because these are places Jews lived, and everywhere they left their traces. Unfortunately, some of those traces have been preserved. So we're thinking of this as being, yes, about YIVO and immediately the work of Hannah, but this is a worldwide phenomenon, the archive. This is a phenomenon which goes forward in different spaces and different places with many different people, and we're lucky to have a gathering. So the question is, where did this whole idea come from of collecting these materials and archiving them? You know, how is it in the 20th century only that people began to do this systematically? For that, we're going to hear from Robert Rothstein, who is an extraordinarily knowledgeable kind of authority on Poland, Russia, YIVO, and the origins of all this work that's in this building and that we're talking about as heritage. Then we'll hear from Gila Flam about the Israeli situation and Lyudmila Sholokhova about Ukraine and its connections to YIVO. And then I'll give a little more personal sense of how I think Hannah fits into all this. Okay? So, Robert Rothstein.
Thank you, Mark. I remember how pleased and proud I was after I would send some small piece of information to Hannah Mlotek for her column in the forwards to see the information printed mit Yiddische Oisis under a large heading, A Brief von Professor Rothstein. My title, you saw in the program, is In the Beginning Were Ginsberg and Marek. That represents a kind of poetic license. It's not quite true, as I'll explain shortly. The title refers to what you all undoubtedly know, the 1901 collection Еврейские народные песни в России, Jewish or Yiddish folk songs in Russia, edited by Shaul Ginsberg and Pesach Marek. I also want to give credit, before I do anything else, to Itzhak Gottesman and his wonderfully detailed history defining the Yiddish nation, the Yiddish folklorists of Poland, and to the relevant articles in the YIVO Encyclopedia, from both of which sources I cribbed shamelessly. First of all, some general orientation about collecting folk songs and other folklore. You don't just stop someone on the street, even on the Yiddish Gas, and say, sing me some songs. That doesn't work. There were various kinds of difficulties in collecting folk songs, but the folk song collection started in the 19th century under the influence of the German Romantics, especially Herder, because they felt that folk songs were evidence of the spirit, the soul of the people, and therefore they had to be preserved if we wanted to learn about the history of our peoples. There was a rush to save what was seen to be disappearing under the influence of urban culture. And this was noted by students of Yiddish folklore as well. In 1912, Yehuda Leib Kahn wrote, quote, "In the larger cities, the authentic folk song is dying out. Little by little, it is being erased from the national memory and forgotten. I think that before long, our authentic folk song will have become a thing of the past." This in fact, at the end of the quote, this in fact echoed language from the introduction to Ginsberg and Marek. Among the difficulties were the mistrust and uncommunicativeness of the folk. Gottesman quotes Pinchas Graubard's accounts of having to escape in a rowboat from what he called an army of Jews who attacked him for collecting folk songs, and of being drenched with water by an elderly Jew who objected to his daughter singing to a strange man. Another problem was distinguishing between true folk songs and songs of literary origin, distinguishing between old songs and new songs. Ginsberg and Marek, for example, tried to set aside examples of what they viewed as recent literary songs and songs by Bathonim. There's an interesting example in the history of Russian folklore collecting. In 1872, the Ukrainian-Russian historian Nikolai Kostomarov urged scholars to collect new songs as well. He was writing in opposition to what had been called the archaeological passion of folklore collectors, looking only for old things. One of his examples, well, he said that we should collect new songs as well because they reflect new attitudes. One of his examples was a song portraying a girl's negative reaction to various potential husbands proposed by her mother, a soldier, a blacksmith, etc. This may remind some of you of a Yiddish song, Wože willst du, a Schneider for a man? A Schneider for a man will ich nicht, and so on. And songs of this type, I discovered, are distributed all over Europe and have a long history going back as far, at least, as 15th century student songs sung in Latin in Prague by students who concluded that the best candidate for a husband was a student, of course. Well, what's wrong with the title, my title? Those of you who are familiar with the Ginsberg and Marek collection probably haven't paid much attention to the bibliography of 146 collections of songs in Yiddish, what they called na razgovorno еврейском языке, in the Jewish vernacular language, that could be found in the Asian Museum of the Imperial Academy of Science. To be sure, most of them probably do not contain folk songs. Some of them only contain one or two songs. But some of these collections have the term folk song in the title. For example, the Avrom Alter Fischson's Der Neuer Meshugener Sammlung Jiddische Volkslieder, published in Warsaw in 1885. Probably the earliest publication of Yiddish folk songs was an article published in 1867 in the Russian language supplement to the Hebrew journal HaKarmel by Ilya Grigorovich Orshansky, who quoted 10 Yiddish songs in Russian translation. Some of these songs he quoted to prove that Jews were not real. It wasn't really true that all Jews were rich. In the 1890s in Warsaw, Yitzchak Lebush Peretz and Yehuda Leib Kahn started systematically collecting Yiddish folk songs. In 1898 in St. Petersburg, Yoel Engel began to transcribe Yiddish folk song melodies, and the same year marked the appearance in Hamburg of the journal Mitteilungen zur Jiddischen Volkskunde, which published Yiddish folklore, including folk songs. In 1889, Yosef Yehuda Lerner published a collection of songs probably collected by him in Odessa in the 1880s. And then, finally in 1888, a call to collect Yiddish folk songs was published in the Hebrew and Russian press in St. Petersburg and Warsaw by two law school graduates, one a professional historian of Russian Jewry, Shoel Ginsberg, and the other an accountant in a soap factory and who pursued historical research in his spare time, Pesach Marek. Why then did I put Ginsberg and Marek at the beginning when there were these other things before Ginsberg and Marek? Well, their collection was the first major collection of Yiddish folk songs, and it resulted from the first serious effort to recruit collectors, sammlers. Their published appeal stressed the importance of information from educated people, intelligente, who live in remote points of the Pale of Settlement, distant from large centers, where both the ancient conditions of life and ancient melodies have been preserved. They got responses, especially from provincial teachers and Zionist activists. They had, in fact, 50 correspondents, including Bore Chaim Kassel from Keidan, grandfather of the Philadelphia journalist Andrew Kassel, a contributor to Mendele, and Moshe Tolpin, the grandfather of Boston area Yiddishistke Martha Tolpin. The 376 texts were printed in Yiddish letters and in transliteration. The editors were unable to include melodies, although they had received some for songs, and hoped to publish a separate volume. Dov Noy, the editor of the 1991 photo reproduction of the Ginsberg and Marek collection, also had such an intention. Neither intention, unfortunately, was realized. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the first 2 decades were extremely active in the area of collecting Yiddish folk songs. There's a detailed account of this activity, its collectors and their collections, in Gottesman's book. I only have time for some highlights. Yiddish folk songs were collected by the Society for Jewish Folk Music in St. Petersburg, largely to serve as a basic for creating new Jewish art music. Collected by the Ansky Ethnographic Expedition to Ukraine. Collections were published in New York by Yehuda Leib Kahn in 1912, in Warsaw by Noé Prilutsky in 1911, 1913. Prilutsky, who called Prilutsky the most prolific collector of Yiddish folk song in the period between the wars, Also in Warsaw, published by Menachem Kipnis in 1918, 1925. Kipnis was a cantor and a singer who traveled around performing later on with his wife, Zmira Zeligfeld, and as they traveled around, they also collected folk songs. He published 2 collections, 1918, 1925. Shmuel Lehman in Warsaw published 2 collections, one in 1929 of worker songs and revolutionary songs called Arbeit und Freiheit, and another in 1928, Ganovim Lieder. And this led to discussions about whether these were really folk songs and whether it was appropriate to include in collections of Yiddish folk songs thieves' songs and prostitute songs and so on. Others also collected in Warsaw. In Vilna, Shlomo Bastomsky published a collection in 1923, and there was a great deal of song material in the wonderful collection Bei uns Jiden in Warsaw, 1923. Kahn, who collected most of his material in Warsaw in the years 1896, 1901, before he went to the United States, explained his methodology. He would sing first to provoke others to sing. This reminds me of my experience teaching courses in folklore. I sometimes teach a course on the proverb, for example, and on the first day I ask students, what proverbs do you know? And they all deny that they know any proverbs. But eventually, when the situation is right, when the situation provokes thought of some proverb, it turns out that they in fact know lots of proverbs. So Kahn realized you can't, as I said in the beginning of my remarks, you can't just walk into a room and say, well, sing me some songs. He would sing, and people would respond by singing in return. He did not have the training to transcribe the melodies, so he memorized them, and later in the United States engaged the services of the cantor and arranger, sometimes known as the Reverend Henry A. Rusotto, who also arranged much liturgical music to transcribe these melodies that he had memorized. Unlike Ginsberg and Marek, who were interested in Yiddish folk songs primarily as historical evidence, Prilutsky was interested in Yiddish dialectology and strove to reproduce the phonetic features of his informant's dialects. Kahn, on the other hand, standardized his texts, printed them in standard Yiddish, arguing that there were not enough letters in the Yiddish alphabet to reflect all the dialect features, and resisted the notion of using the Latin alphabet to transcribe the text phonetically. Prilutsky wrote in 1911 that he had begun collecting folk songs in February, I wrote down here February 2010, that's probably wrong, in February 1910. And in that time, in about 8 months, he had collected 2,000 songs. He wrote, the Yiddish street is bathed in songs. It is an ocean. You can go out with your bucket and scoop them up. Bot sich take die jiddische Gassen Lieder, a jam is es, geh a reus mit an Emmer und Shep. He also quoted the Ukrainian-Russian writer Nikolai Gogol about how songs are born. He mistranslated what Gogol said. Gogol has a long sentence in his. He wrote an article about Ukrainian folk songs, in which he talked about songs being created when he really said that soul vibrates. Songs are written or are created not with a pen in the hand, not on paper, but when the soul resonates and so on. Prilutsky talked about quoted Gogol as saying a song is created when the soul quivers, wenn die Neshama zappelt, and said, and whose soul quivers? This is Prilutsky, not Gogol. And whose soul quivers more than the Jews? One folklorist who is not often mentioned was a man named Binyamin Wolf Zegel. It's spelled in Yiddish Zegel, although it's often, when he's mentioned as Siegel, S-E-G-A-L in English. Probably not mentioned because his ethnographic studies of Jewish on Jewish topics He published in German and Polish periodicals in the years 1889 to 1984. He sent Prilocki 100 songs from Eastern Galicia. In an 1893 Polish language article, Zegel published a song that included the stanza, red cherries I pick, green I leave alone, a handsome I'm losing my English. I'm looking at a Polish text. And fiancé, a handsome fiancé I take for myself, an ugly one the ugly ones I let go. Czerwony czereśnie sobie wybieram, zielony zostawiam, pięknego narzeczonego sobie biorę, brzydkiego puszczam. This may remind you of a Yiddish song. Schwarze Karschlach Reisman und grüne lässt man stehen, schöne Mädelach nimmt man und miese lässt man gehen. Different perspective, masculine versus feminine, but the same notion. The Lexicon von der Neue Jiddische Literatur claims that Zegel was the one who discovered the identity of the Russian falsifier of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, about which he published a book in Berlin in 1926. 1925, YIVO was established. From the very beginning, it had an ethnographic commission, part of the philological section. The name was changed to Folklore Commission in 1930 at the suggestion of Kahn, who was the leading YIVO folklorist. It ultimately had an extensive network of Sammlers, including teachers of the Yiddish schools, the Yiddish secular schools, who constituted about a quarter of the Sammlers in 1929, and ordinary working people, 1/3 of the group, who sometimes had to write to YIVO to ask for money for paper and postage. And this is testimony to the connection between the Jewish folk, the Jewish masses, working people, and this intellectual elite organization that was YIVO. By 1929, the members, there were 163 Sammlerkreisen, circles of collectors, clubs of collectors. They had sent in more than 50,000 copies of proverbs, folk tales, and folk songs. YIVO published important works, 3 volumes of substantial periodical or annual, I guess, although it wasn't published every year, 1926, 28, 29, called Jiddische Philologie, which contained folk song material. They published Kahn's collections of folk tales in 1931, based on material that had been sent in by Sammlers. On the title page, it's identified as Volume 1 of a planned Jiddische Folklore Bibliothek, which apparently, I don't know that there was ever a Volume 2 or further. The archivists can tell me. Jiddische Folklore is in 1938, was the result of the Sammler's work, edited by Kahn. Later, after the war, there were further YIVO publications based on Kahn's work, a collection of his folklore studies, mostly dealing with Yiddish folk songs in 1952, and a collection of his, and a revised and annotated edition of his 1912 2-volume collection of Yiddish folk songs, both edited by Max Weinreich. After 1930, there was a change in emphasis, from collecting to training the young scholars, the so-called aspirantur, kind of graduate study. The most important of these scholars was Shmuel Zanvil Piper, whose major annotated collection of Yiddish folk songs from Galicia wasn't published until 1971, 28 years after his death, in an edition edited by Dov and Meir Noy. Work of these collectors and scholars was continued by Ruth Rubin and Chana Mlotek, and by younger scholars and performers here and now, not so much here maybe, but now certainly, who have been interviewing immigrants from the former Soviet Union and elderly Jews, remaining Jews in Belarus and Ukraine and Lithuania. I don't have time, unfortunately, to talk about the important work of Soviet folklorists and ethnomusicologists in Ukraine and Belarus, especially of Moshe Beregovsky in the 1920s and 30s, who collected and published and analyzed. I trust that my co-panelists, Mark Slobin and Mila Sholokhova, will at least mention them, and you can learn about them from their published work. Thank you very much.
want to know if it's good morning or good afternoon. It's an honor for me to come here and speak about the Chana Mlotek, and in honor of Chana Mlotek. She was always assisting me in my research on Yiddish songs as a young scholar when I researched the songs of the Lodz Ghetto. She was very happy that I found songs that she has never known before, and she was more happy when she could find the original melody that the song was based on. I also wanted to mention another teacher of mine, Professor Dov Noy, that also passed away in 2013, almost at the same time that Chana passed away, and he also was a great collector and teacher for me in my research on Yiddish folk songs. And I would like to start with the song Hoben mir a Nigendl that was composed by Nochem Sternheim. And I, with the Professor Dovno, we published this volume of the songs of Nochem Sternheim in Israel, in English, Yiddish, and Hebrew. And the performance that you would hear today, which is also the theme of my paper, is first in Yiddish by Nechama Lifshitz. It's not working. My music. That's him. No.
Okay, do you want to move on to the next one, and then I'll try again?
Auf mir Nigendl singt man es zusammen, singen mir, es klingt es so schön. Das hat gesungen der Tate mit der Mame, wenn sie seinen Kinderler geben, ai, 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 oh, das euch wieder nie klingt das Zinder, als a Freilich singt die Kinderei, dari-dai, 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 dari-mai, dai-dai, dam, als a Freilich no mir alle gehen. Ob mir ein Nigendl singt man es geseder, singen mir es in des Meeres, klingt es alles schön. Das hat gesungen der Rebenu in Cheder, wenn mir seinen Kinderler geben, ai, 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 ai. Tari-tai, tori-toi, tori-toi, tori-mai, ai, 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 ai. Tari-tai, tori-toi, tori-toi, tori-mai, ai, 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 ai. Tari-tai, tori-toi, tori-toi, tori-mai, ai, ai, ai. Ai, 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 ai. Hab mir
You already noticed that the lyrics that I showed are not the same as the lyrics that Nechama Lifshitz sings, which means an art song that becomes a folk song and each singer is changing it. And now another change is the Hebrew verse of this same song. First of all, it omits also the grandfather and the grandmother. It only has brothers and sisters and later fathers and mothers. It doesn't have all the Hasidic and Mishpoche tradition, and it says, "Ine lanu nigun yesh, al na nevaishenu." We have a nigun. Let's not make it a shame, or let's keep covet or bring some covet to this nigun, which is not obvious for the Israeli singers. even here, there's a difference between the Hebrew version that I screened and the Hebrew version that they sing. And this is just an example that I will talk about, how Yiddish songs became part of Israeli songs without mentioning that they were Yiddish, and the ideology of the Zionist movement made the lyrics adapt to what the song should speak about. And now I would go about what we have in the National Library regarding Yiddish folk songs. The music department of the National Library of Israel, which this year celebrates 120 years since its establishment, holds a large, maybe the largest collection of Jewish music material, including Yiddish song and Israeli song in print, manuscript, and recordings. These collections were assembled by the library and by private collectors who donated their collections to the National Library. The catalogers of the music collection have been cataloging the collection in a detailed analytical manner, aiming to describe each song or musical piece, its creators, origins, arrangements, subject, style, and other information that reflect the richness and complexity of the musical piece in order to allow access to users who search in various ways and sometimes have only partial information. The two main collections of Yiddish song at the music department are the Jacob Michael collection of Jewish music, which includes books, music, notes, and recordings, and the Meir Noy collection of Yiddish song, the brother of Professor Dov Noy, in print and manuscripts and transcriptions made by the collector. The Jacob Michael collection. The Yiddish part of the collection is comprised of approximately 4,000 pieces in print and 4,000 records, most of which are Yiddish songs. The collection had a card catalog that was used until recently. Jacob Michael was a businessman from New York who collected Yiddish music in New York in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s and donated it to the National Library in 1964. 5 years ago, the second archive, the sound archive, was digitized thanks to the generous support of the Legacy Heritage Fund from New York. And this enabled our catalogers to listen to the music and to create an enhanced and analytical catalog. This work is still in progress. Access will be provided online. Actually, it is online already. The Meir Noy collection of Yiddish song. Meir Noy began collecting Hebrew and Yiddish song after the Holocaust as he wanted to preserve the lost culture and traditions of Eastern European folk song and of the new creation of the Israeli folk song. He began his collection while imprisoned in Cyprus DP camp in 1947 and continued until his death in 1998. He donated his collection in 1988, 10 years before his death, to the National Library of Israel. This collection includes published songs, as well as manuscripts and transcriptions that Meir Noy made of songs that people sang to him or that he heard on the radio. These songs were originally cataloged by Meir Noy on a card catalog. You can see an example of some of his cards that also include the incipits of the music. And it contained additional information. Now it is cataloged in the library's Aleph catalog. Both Noy catalog and the library catalog are analytical. In other words, each song is cataloged individually. This is of primary importance for both researchers and performers. And you can see in the other example, he took all the songs that Hannah and Yossam Lotek published in the forewords, and he cut them, and put them on a piece of paper in notebooks, and then he made 5 cards for each song. So all the songs that Hannah Lotek had ever published can be found in Meir Noy collection because it has a card catalog, and you can find by title and by author and by subject. To both collections, new material is continually being added. The new material comes from people who learn about our collections and would like to add songs, assuming we don't have them. The National Sound Archives initiates field recordings of people who still can recall Yiddish songs. However, it is getting increasingly difficult to find people who recall songs that have never been recorded. The music department, who holds Yiddish song collections that came from other sources. These collections were digitized and cataloged by our professional Yiddish catalogers. These collections include, for example, things that you know, the Ben Stonehill collection from YIVO, which has been redigitized and cataloged analytically song by song with all the details on it. The Ruth Rubin collection that came from the Haifa Emily Music Library was digitized by Beta Tfutzot and was cataloged by our catalogers. The Kaczerginski collection from Yad Vashem. These are very important collection of the 1946 Culture Commission led by Kaczerginski in Munich and was donated to Yad Vashem. And also a collection that I've made of survivors, especially from Vilna Ghetto and from Lodz Ghetto. We can mention here Yaakov Gelman, another scholar who was the head of the archive before me, who collected Yiddish songs of survivors from various ghettos, especially from Lodz. And Michael Lukin, who also collected songs, Yiddish songs, and also Hasidic nigunim. And other people who collected and donated it to the National Sound Archive. The total number of catalog records of musical material in Yiddish at the National Library is 32,000, compared, for example, to 4,000 records in Ladino, which is a very comprehensive collection at the Music Library. Maybe it's the largest collection of sound in Ladino we have, and it's only 4,000 songs. The entire sound collection of the Sound Archives has been digitized and access is provided through our internet site. This project took place from 2007 to 2013, as I said, thanks to the generous support of Legacy Heritage Fund. This project is outstanding in its volume and quality, and users have begun to use it. It comprises of 32,000 hours of recorded sound. The challenge now is to enhance access to and increase awareness of the material in larger audiences. The great project of digitization and professional cataloging of our song collection has not made a difference in the field of Yiddish song in Israel and also in the world. Most of the users are scholars, especially musicologists, and even they usually need a mediator who knows the language and the music collection. We don't see yet a change in attitude to the entire repertoire of Yiddish song in Israel today. However, the first harbinger of Yiddish music performances by Israeli singers took place with the assistance of our librarians and archivists, and with the assistance of the music department and the National Library. And I would like to talk about two performances that were initiated by the musician Yair Harel. Yair Harel researched the Sound Archive collection for a project of performing traditional folk songs of Jewish women singing in their mother tongue. He commissioned one of our librarians, Amy Simon, to conduct the research for him. Amy, who has a master's degree in Yiddish, located about 100 pieces, out of which 2 songs were included in Yiddish, Die Goldene Pave and Unter Yankeles Wiegele. These songs were arranged by 2 Jewish musicians commissioned by Yair Harel, who came to Israel from the Caucasus, Peretz and Mark Eliyahu, and were sung by Yiddish singer Ruth Levin, the daughter of Leibo Levin, who knew the songs actually, regardless to our archivist's great research from home. This performance also included Yemenite, Persian, and Ladino Jewish songs in the original Jewish languages, sung by Israeli singers who grew up knowing these musical traditions. These songs were arranged as a suite with long instrumental sections. And I would like to play you one example of Ruth Levin with Mark and Peretz Eliyahu. Okay. Comanche and oh, sorry. And these 2 minutes are part of a suite which takes about 7 minutes. Yair Harel, in a second project, focused on love songs, also sung by women in their mother tongue. He used the same musicians, but only used one singer, this time Victoria Hana, who is of Persian Jewish background, and she sang in Yiddish. The Yiddish songs that he selected with us together and Victoria sang were Woje willst du a Schneider Faraman, that you mentioned, and Papyrus doch Weiß. So throughout the 100+ years of Zionism and the 66 years of the State of Israel, the Yiddish song has not entirely disappeared from Israel's musical landscape. Many songs were translated and adapted into Hebrew and are part of the popular repertoire. When published or recorded, some editors mention the Yiddish origin of the song, as many others, most of them, don't, and claim the origin of the song as Amami, folk song. But today, as in the 1930s, Oriental music is pushing Ashkenazi music off stage or at least away from the center of the stage. That is why it is so important to digitize and catalog the song collections in our archive. When the time comes, and we are confident that it will come, when researchers and performers alike will look for Yiddish songs, they will be able to find them. Once again, grandchildren will sing the songs of their grandparents, their nigendel, their nigun, their melody, their song will connect generations and bond their culture. It is our hope that more researchers around the world will use our archives especially now after it has been digitized. It is our hope that more cooperation will take place between our archives and other institutions' archives. It is our hope that Yiddish song will be a part of the new Jewish-Israeli soundscape of the 21st century and beyond. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Lyudmila Sholokhova, and I'm a head librarian and acting chief archivist at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. I'm originally from Ukraine, and I spent many years working with at the Vernadsky National Library of Ukraine with the Ansky expeditions materials and with the archives of Moisei Beregovsky. The Vernadsky National Library of Ukraine is one of only very few libraries in the world that possesses a major collection of Yiddish folk songs. For its unparalleled scope and content, this collection was recognized by UNESCO as a unique monument of authentic Jewish music tradition of Jews in Eastern Europe, and it was included in the UNESCO Register Memory of the World in 2005. The bulk of the materials came from the music collections assembled during the ethnographic expeditions of the Jewish Historical Ethnographical Society in St. Petersburg. Those expeditions were funded by Baron Vladimir Ginsburg and took place under Semyon Ansky's leadership in 1912-1914 in Kiev, Volyn, and Podolia provinces of the Russian Empire. Another major component of the Vernadsky Library collections came from the archives of the ethnographic section, later folklore department of the Institute for Jewish Proletarian Culture in Kiev, that existed in the system of the Soviet Academy of Sciences of Ukraine in the late 1920s through 1940s. This part of the collection was assembled by the Ukrainian Jewish musicologist Moisei Beregovsky during expeditions of 1929-1947. In addition, separate portions of the music archives currently in possession of the Vernadsky National Library of Ukraine came from the private archives of composer Joel Engel and folklorist Zinovy Kiselgov, who were participants of the Ansky expeditions in 1912-1913. Kiselgov, however, continued to make recordings on his own in Belarus and St. Petersburg well into the 1920s. While a major scope of the materials was recorded on phonocylinders on the territories of Russian Empire within the Jewish Pale of Settlement before the October Revolution of 1917 and in central or southern Ukraine in 1920s, 1930s, one small portion of the archives really stood out. About 170 sound recordings on 70 cylinders dated July 1913 were taken by Yitzhak Luria, student of the courses for Oriental Studies in St. Petersburg, during his stay in Palestine with financial support of the Society for Jewish Folk Music in St. Petersburg. Yitzhak Luria later became a manager of the Jewish Museum in St. Petersburg that, in addition to artifacts and manuscripts, also hosted music collections. The music archives assembled before 1917 previously belonged to Jewish Museum in St. Petersburg. But after shutting down all Jewish scholarly institutions in St. Petersburg in 1930, these materials were transferred to Kiev, to a newly created Institute of Jewish Proletarian Culture that was established in 1929. In 1936, this institute was reduced to a small organization, a cabinet for Yiddish language, literature, and folklore. The cabinet was liquidated in 1949, followed by the arrest of the major part of its staff. The phono archive materials were confiscated and went into closed holdings of the Vernadsky Central Scientific Library of Ukraine, now it's National Library of Ukraine, where they were kept for almost half a century. The treasures of the phono archive and related musical manuscript were discovered in 1993. The history of the collections and their collectors, as well as ethnographical expeditions, is well researched. It is available in a number of publications and partially reflected in my PhD on Jewish music folklore studies in Russian Empire. Materials contain original recordings on the Vex Edison phono cylinders. There is total 1,000 cylinders in different physical condition, with approximately almost 4,000 musical works, musical and text transcriptions from the recordings. This is only phono archival part, but the entire body of the Vernadsky Library collections is musical collections is about 8,000 musical items, including folk songs, klezmer melodies, cantorial compositions, Hasidic nigunim, and Purim spiels. On the next slide, please see the example of the transcription from the Ansky expeditions as recorded and transcribed by Zinovy Kisilgov. And this is an example how they actually documented their work. And this is the example of music transcriptions done by Moisei Beregovsky in 1930s. They had a special music formulas, music, like you can see this is standard, there was a standard form for musical transcriptions, and this is the example of this. The project of digitizing materials from the Ansky phono archives and Beregovsky archives was carried out by the Institute for Information Recording at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine and the Vernadsky National Library of Ukraine in 1996-1999. The Institute for Information Recording introduced at that time pioneering optical methods of sound reproduction from Edison cylinders. It was very new in 1990s. During the project, only phono cylinders in perfect and good physical conditions were digitized. Cylinders with serious mold damage or physical damage, broken cylinders, were not re-recorded. Physical condition of the cylinders was reflected as an important aspect of detailed archival descriptions in my catalog, Phono Archive of Jewish Musical Heritage, published in 2001 by the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. In total, about 600 cylinders were digitized within 3 years. They currently represent the oldest and unparalleled scope of original non-commercial Jewish music heritage of Ashkenazi civilization available in live sound, with oldest recording dated 1912-1913, Ansky expeditions. Major scope of those recordings represents Yiddish folk songs in the genres variety. I just wanted to remind you that in contemporary Jewish music studies, Yiddish folk songs are classified according to the sequence of events in people's life. And the prominent Yiddish folklorist Dov Noy, whom Gila Flom mentioned today, actually created the entire genre system and regroup Yiddish folk songs into 4 categories. The first category is life cycle, Lebenszyklus, that includes lullaby songs, school songs, love songs, wedding songs, family songs, and songs about death. This is the first category, life cycle. And second category is annual cycle of events. It includes songs of Shabbat and Yom Tovim, or holiday songs. The next category is national songs, and there is a large category, Verschiedene, or different songs. It's a very general category, and it includes variety of song genres. And there are many subcategories inside this category, including songs of Hasidic gatherings, ballads, songs of beggars, cantonese and soldier songs, songs of social movements, songs of workers, revolutionary songs, immigrant songs, and songs of criminals, interval songs. So now I just wanted to bring to your attention one song from the collection of Moisei Beregovsky that was recorded. Here is a transcription of the song, and now we will hear it in the live sound. Das Lied von den Tyrannen. It is interesting that it is performed by a very young singer, 14 years old, Baruch Zilberstein, recorded in Kiev in 1929.
Demol seine Gefallen, die Stern von dem Himmel, YIVO schlafen danach, wenn ihr Ronnen nicht zu weinen und zu klagen, die Brüder, was macht in sich hier verschickt, es sei Männer reingegangen sind, Armen mit Soldaten, hat sie alle Männer arrestiert, also wie ich jetzt auf euch verfahrt.
There is one more song available also in this. Actually, you saw how the text transcription look in the Beregovsky collection. This is a TypeScript transcription of the song. Hab ich mir Pidjekala von Anayam Gewand. Is also very interesting, very good quality of the sound. It was recorded by Moisei Beregovsky in Odessa in June 1930.
Hab ich mir Pidjekala von Anayam Gewand. Ra la 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 la. Ihre Menschen, ihre Gewinne kenn ich nennen dieser Hand. Ra la 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 la. Der Lieber hab ich sich was racht und ich hab von dem Pidjekala kaputt. Ra la 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 la. Ra la 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 la.
And now it's very interesting example that I'm going to show you now. Sometimes klezmer melodies are recorded by Beregovsky reveal original tunes of the famous Yiddish theater songs. The melodies that you're going to hear now was recorded from the amateur flutist and barber Yitzhak Triplik in Slavuta on August 16, 1929. This melody is identical to Herman Yablokov's song Kupite Kovzhe Kovzhe Papirosin, and as we all know, the song was composed by Herman Yablokov for his play Papirosin, and it was first performed in New York in 1935. But when I was working with the materials in the Beregovsky collection, I found exactly the same tune played by flutists, and it was recorded in Slavuta in 1929. So it actually shows that the origin of the song was a folk klezmer melody. Over the years, 1997, 2013, 7 CDs and CD-ROMs were produced in Kiev based on the recordings from the expeditions. Total number of melodies reproduced on the CDs was 2010. It is, of course, too little in comparison with the volume of the entire collection. The CDs were published sporadically and totally dependent on very little or overall lack of financial support for the project. Despite great historical value, those recordings were not supposed and never actually didn't have commercial success. Projected collaboration initiative between the National Library of Ukraine and National Library of Israel didn't result in an agreement for a number of reasons and were eventually blocked by the Ukrainian side. In addition, distribution of the CDs outside of Ukraine created further problems. However, most recently, the Rothschild Foundation, Hanadiv Europe, expressed serious interest in renewing work on this gigantic project and in further promoting those outstanding and little-known Jewish musical treasures. 3 CD-ROMs containing music recordings from the Hasidic music from the Ansky expedition and materials of the first expeditions of Moshe Beregovsky were produced in 2013, and plans are underway to continue this work. The last CDs are very well documented and include detailed information and historical notes about the recordings, and I had the privilege to be a contributor to the production of those recordings. Access to the collections in Kiev remains partially limited. While manuscript materials, music and text transcriptions of the recordings, and personal archives of Zinovy Kiselgov and Joel Engel are accessible to the community at the Vernadsky National Library of Ukraine, the unpublished sound recordings are not available to the general public. One of the reasons is that it is because the sound recordings are not in the audible condition and require a lot of meticulous and costly preparation, cleaning and restoration labor. There are still hundreds of treasured melodies to be discovered. Striking variety and high quality of unique musical materials recorded in the first half of the 20th century provides excellent opportunity to experience the world of authentic Eastern European Jewish musical traditions. Listening to those melodies today revives our collective memory, shapes our better understanding of the past, and creates excitement needed for research and study of this music today. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to thank our speakers for putting out a huge panorama of the possibilities. I will be brief, although because this being a Yiddish event, we all need a glazel tea, which we get after I talk. But it's always amazing to me. We go back to 1048 Fifth Avenue to the old YIVO building, which is now the Neue Galerie. It's totally disorienting. The first time I walked in there, everything was beautifully polished and things. I said, but what was this room? Oh, that's where they made the tea. Right, I remember. And now it's like the, part of the Neue Galerie. But tea making was very important, so we have to pay homage to that tradition too. It falls to me to say a specific word about Hannah Mlotek herself. I'm going to be short, but I want to take up one aspect of her, the fact that she was two people. Eleanor Gordon Mlotek and Hannah Mlotek were one and the same person. But the binomial bilingual life she led as an activist, an archivist, and a scholar is crucial to understanding her contribution and her legacy. For above all, Eleanor Hannah was a mediator in many ways, of which I'll touch on only 3. Between the European and the American-born generations of Yiddishists, between a Yiddish-bred audience and mainstream American culture, and between the practices of scholarship and archiving and those of everyday community life. Hannah's short memoir of her work with Max Weinreich at YIVO is instructive. She was his secretary from 1946 to 51. He himself was the great mediator between Europe and America, but was initially unfamiliar with New World ways. Hannah probably helped, being American-born. She had to adapt quickly, though, herself. She says she came with little Yiddish and was in awe of the high level of language around the building. Weinreich, she says, just kept teaching her, even while dictating letters. She had many tasks to perform, and they all shaped her later scholarly and archival work, such as helping with the standardization of orthography and transliteration, or working on maps of Eastern European locales. This gave her the cultural and probably social capital in the building for her own intermediary role between scholarly generations. This foundation was broadened and deepened by her graduate training in what we used to call folkloristics at UCLA. This mainstream education outfitted her with the expert source-seeking, migration studies, and research and writing skills that she needed to continue on the scholarly path. Eleanor's articles in English make full use of this background. Writing to a general academic audience, she wisely chooses comparative topics that locate and implicitly celebrate Yiddish folklore, which was presumed to be lost and certainly neglected. And again, we're talking about the mainstream American academic world. By showing the distinctive contribution of Yiddish folklore to the larger European Studies project, she stakes a claim both for the tradition and for herself as a mediator. Her prose is very much in the current writing style of the day that I still knew as a graduate student. Just on the first page, sentences start with, "It is to be remembered that." Notwithstanding, needless to state, detection of these shared themes has afforded insight into, and so forth. But there's a subtle agenda that she's pushing by deploying this academic capital. Scholarship saw Yiddish folklore as both marginal and fragmentary, as measured against mainstream European traditions. Eleanor boldly turns the argument around. She says, the historian of Yiddish folklore cannot afford to consider the German, Slavic, or any other versions authoritative. The early folklore of these nations, too, needs to be reconstructed. Okay, and nice little stuff. She goes a step further, even seeing Yiddish as a source for the mainstream. She says, it is ironic that whereas Yiddish texts and collections have been irrevocably lost, in the Wallach collection, which is from around 1600, it contains about 40 German songs in Yiddish letters. So turn to us, and don't be patronizing. Okay? This is a mediator facing both ways. Eleanor barely touches on the destruction of the culture, only pointing out in closing that researchers as well as materials were destroyed. Yet in the same sentence, she adds, systematic research can still find ways to do comparative work on the basis of Yiddish folklore. It's a very interesting stance as I read through this work, particularly this English language work of hers. It really impressed me. It is in her Yiddish articles that Hannah gives full voice to a deep sadness and mourning for the indescribable losses of researchers and materials. A long, poignant essay, for example, recuperates the figure of A. Weiter, which was the pen name of a Vilna writer and activist killed in 1919 by occupying Polish forces. Hannah goes into an elegiac and more colorful mode of writing that shows her intimate knowledge of the politics, the culture, and the literature of the vanished European milieu. This prose lies at the other end of the spectrum from the English scholarly style I just cited. It is ironic, she says, that he was murdered at the hands of the Poles, whom he liked so much, and of whose literature he was such an enthusiastic fan. I was surprised to see that this ironic voice runs through much of Hannah's work, given how generous, sympathetic, and straightforward it is, through all her songs collections and analyses. For example, in writing about European Yiddish songs on the theme of America, not everyone would have included this folk commentary on the condescending and crude American community representatives who brought money to the poor Polish Jews. Our American brothers send us dollars. Blessed be their deeds. There is only one thing bothering us, brothers. Why must you send us the delegates? Or, long live America for sending us bread. May the committee men all drop dead. In part, this tendency flows naturally from Hannah's great empathy with the Yiddish-speaking masses, past and present. She wonders aloud in this article why there were no more folk songs about America after the end of mass immigration in 1924. Was it because America had become an unattainable dream, or was it that the daily, more pressing problems took precedence? Here she's mediating between an American and a European perspective, and she's musing about what was really the generation of her own childhood, not some distant folklore past, the 1920s. So here she's kind of, again, mediating between her experience as an American being brought up with Yiddish culture. Why didn't they sing any more songs about America anymore? At the same time, she's doing this scholarly kind of organizational analytical writing about it. And this is because her approach to the folk song went beyond Eleanor's detached, if partisan, appeal. Hannah simply thought that the feelings of individuals, as expressed in song, are in some respects comparable to letters, memoirs, interviews, or even autobiographies. The primacy of the song, then, above all, is her most potent perspective and made her message maximally meaningful to a variety of audiences. This deep understanding of daily community life allowed Hannah and her constant collaborator Yossel to accomplish the extraordinary project that is the Perl von der Jiddische Poesie. Instigating reader response in the main surviving Yiddish language vehicle, the Vorwärts, the Moteks ingeniously gathered poetic pearls from the depths of a sunken culture. In the English edition, published just a few years ago, Hannah steers a middle course of empathy between Jewish insiders and a potential mainstream audience. This readership would now include the next generations of non-Yiddish-speaking American Jews, themselves bridging a cultural gap. She offers biographies and comments and organizes headings by the authors of the lyrics, but claims not to be a literary scholar, just pointing people to the writers. This is another major form of mediation for her and all through her work between music and poetry. Hannah gives accurate texts of poems that have been folklorized into songs, and then tells readers to compare them with their own personal versions, which will differ. This trafficking between the world of the scholar, folklorist, literary critic, cultural historian, and the ordinary Yiddish-bred person makes her contribution to Jewish and American culture distinctive. The Perl Project expanded from the Yiddish-only beginnings in the Vorwärts to a book version that was published first in Yiddish, then in English, with a bilingual text, only intensifying Hannah's border-crossing position. But she had been doing this earlier. Back in 1964, she had begun the outreach work by producing a list of 55 commercial recordings of Yiddish songs. It's a kind of a guide to people what to buy. Almost ironically, again, she points out that the new boom in folk music recording, this is the folk revival that's going on, comes from an industry that is fully exploiting this phenomenon for profitable purposes, but which has also revolutionized the natural processes of folk song transmission. Her next phrase, bridging gaps between sophisticated and backward civilizations and cultures, seems sharply poised, given that it's the exploitation of Yiddish song that she is addressing. In summary, Hannah's positioning as an American-born Yiddishist made it possible for her to feel confident about her mediating role. Firmly grounded in activism, she could both transmit and even create the culture she represented. Anchored in the American scene, she could sustain the buffeting winds of history that had scattered the community that she stood up for. The social activism she represented so energetically faded under the pressure of annihilation, aging, and assimilation. But the archive, our main topic today, gave her a home. Seemingly detached from community work, and I haven't even touched on the summer camps, the theatricals, and family transmission, Hannah turned the shelves of hard-won materials into a hub of activity. As the queries flowed into YIVO rather than the Vorwärts, Hannah could guide Barbara Streisand and Michael Tilson Thomas, along with the growing ranks of young Yiddishists looking for sources and inspiration. The archive shifted from its defensive position as a refuge of European sources to an outward-looking stance. It turned into a cultural channel of transmission. The remarkable thing about Eleanor Hannah remains that rare ability to buoyantly move from sphere to sphere of work in the face of monumental human and cultural loss. She was a living proof that the archivist can also be an activist, and I hope her work lives on in print, online, and new digital resources, but also in spirit. Thank you. Sorry.